On the afternoon of April 17, 2021, in the choir of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beneath stone vaulting that had absorbed 8 centuries of royal grief, Penelope Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, sat in a pew arranged according to a seating plan that had been the subject of 3 weeks of quiet negotiation between the Lord Chamberlain's office, the Mountbatten family, and at least one private secretary whose involvement was never officially acknowledged. She was 67 years old. She wore black. She wore a hat with a veil that covered the upper half of her face, which was useful because the cameras of the assembled press, restricted by pandemic protocols to a single pool position, had been instructed to identify the mourners and to do so accurately, and Penny was one of only 30 people present at the funeral of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who had died 8 days earlier at the age of 99. The Queen sat alone in a separate pew, in a black mask, observing the social distancing rules that the rest of the country had been observing under threat of fine, and which the royal family was observing under the additional weight of being seen to observe them. The image of Elizabeth II in that pew, isolated, would become one of the defining photographs of the pandemic in Britain, reproduced in newspapers around the world as evidence of a monarch's discipline, a widow's grief, and a nation's shared deprivation. It was a powerful image. It was also, in the specific way that royal images function, a managed one. The seating plan had been built outward from the Queen's pew, and the placement of every other mourner had been calibrated against it. Penny was placed 3 pews back, on the opposite side of the chapel from the senior royal family, in the section reserved for what the order of service described as close family friends. She was, on paper, the godmother of Princess Eugenie's son and a long-standing friend of the Duke through the family connection of her late husband, Norton Knatchbull, the 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, who was Prince Philip's second cousin once removed. She was, in the actual texture of Prince Philip's life across the previous 3.5 decades, something else, the precise nature of which has never been publicly resolved, and which the institutional architecture surrounding both of them has been organized, with considerable effort, to keep unresolved. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The thing the seating plan could not communicate, and which the people in that chapel could read with the practiced fluency of those who have spent their lives in rooms where placement is grammar, was that Penny had been placed close enough to be present and far enough to be deniable. She had been included, which mattered, because exclusion would have been its own statement. She had not been placed near the family, which also mattered, because proximity would have been a different statement. The placement was, in the careful way that the British establishment has been making placements for centuries, exactly correct. She did not weep visibly. She had been managing surfaces for so long that the management had become indistinguishable from the surface itself. The cameras moved on. The service continued. The hymns Prince Philip had selected, including one he had composed himself for the occasion, filled the chapel and emptied again into the spring afternoon. Outside, the country watched on television, and Penny existed for most viewers as a name in a caption still, a face under a veil, a footnote in a ceremony that was about something larger and someone else. This is the story of how she got into that pew, and what she gave up to be allowed to remain in it, and what was written and what was burned and what is sealed, and what the institution that sealed it understood about her, and about him, and about the particular kind of relationship that 2 thoughtful people can construct inside the gaps left by the lives they were assigned. It is also a story about letters. The letters Buckingham Palace will never release are not, by all available accounts, scandalous in the way the public uses that word. They are something more difficult, which is private, and the institution's interest in keeping them private is not the institution's usual interest in concealing wrongdoing. It is the more complicated institutional interest in keeping a particular kind of intimacy off the record entirely, because the record once made cannot be unmade, and the institution does not know what it would mean. She was born Penelope Eastwood on April 15, 1953, in a London that was less than a year out from the coronation, in a country that had spent the better part of a decade rebuilding from a war it had won and could not afford to have won. Her father, Reginald Eastwood, ran a chain of restaurants. The chain was Angus Steakhouse, which would by the end of the 1960s occupy a peculiar middle position in British casual dining, neither fashionable nor unfashionable, neither cheap nor expensive, present in central London locations the way a kind of upholstered furniture is present, expected without being noticed. Reginald was the son of a man who had owned a butcher's shop in Manchester, and the steakhouse business was an extension of that family's practical understanding of meat as a commodity that could be sold in industrial quantities to the British middle class, who had recently acquired enough disposable income to eat steak in restaurants where the lighting was low and the carpet was patterned in a way that hid stains. Her mother, Marion, was the daughter of a clergyman and brought to the Eastwood household the particular quality of provincial gentility that 19th-century Anglican parsonages produced and 20th-century English suburbs absorbed. She read novels, she played the piano adequately. She had married at 23, which was on time by the standards of her circle. She loved Penelope and her older brother in the conventional way that women of her class loved their children, through the management of nannies, schools, and the careful curation of the social context in which the children would form their first impressions of the world. The Eastwoods were not aristocratic, they were not titled, they were what the British class system in its Baroque elaboration called comfortable, which meant they had enough money to live well and not enough to attract notice. They lived in a house in St. John's Wood with a garden, and they kept a small place in the country that was used for weekends. Penelope had a pony for a period in childhood, which she rode without enthusiasm. She was sent to a girls' day school in London, where she was reported by her teachers to be quiet, intelligent, and unobtrusive in the way that the children of self-made families learn to be unobtrusive when they are being educated alongside the children of older money. Her own assessment of her childhood, in the few public statements she has ever made about it, has been generous and brief. She has described her parents as kind. She has described her early life as happy. She has not elaborated. The reticence is consistent with everything else that can be observed about her, which is that she does not talk about herself when she does not have to, and most of the time she does not have to. She was sent away to school at 13, to a girls' boarding school in Sussex, in the way that families with aspirations sent their daughters to schools where they would meet girls whose families were a step or two further up the social ladder than their own. She did adequately academically. She made friends who would remain her friends into adulthood. She was, by the accounts of the women who knew her during those years, considered pretty without being striking, popular without being central, and possessed of a kind of contained quality that was not quite shyness and not quite reserve, but which made her difficult to read, even for the friends who knew her best. She left school at 18 and did not go to university. This was 1971, and university for women of her background was becoming standard but was not yet inevitable. She enrolled instead in a secretarial course in London, which produced a qualification that was meant to bridge the period between school and marriage. She worked briefly. The job was at her father's company, which was either a sinecure or an entry-level position depending on whose account one accepts, and lasted about 18 months. She left when she met the man who would become her first husband, who was, in the way that these things were arranged in the social circles she was beginning to enter, exactly the kind of man her parents had been quietly arranging for her to meet for several years. His name was Norton Knatchbull. He was the eldest son of John Knatchbull, the 7th Baron Brabourne, a film producer who had married Patricia Mountbatten, the elder daughter of Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, which meant that Norton was Lord Mountbatten's grandson, and which meant, among other things, that his godfather was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who was Mountbatten's nephew, and who had taken a particular interest in Norton's upbringing in the way that he had taken an interest in all of the Mountbatten grandchildren. The Mountbattens were, in the carefully tended genealogical web that organized the upper reaches of British and European aristocracy, a kind of secondary family to the British royal family, related by blood and reinforced by repeated intermarriage, and the children of the Brabourne household had grown up moving between Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate in Hampshire, and the various royal residences, with the easy familiarity of cousins. Penelope Eastwood and Norton Knatchbull met in 1974. The introduction was made through mutual friends, in the specific way that introductions in that world are made through mutual friends, which is to say that nothing about it was random, even when the people involved understood it to be random. Norton was 27, blonde, friendly, and possessed of a slightly diffuse quality that some women found endearing and others found exhausting. He had been to Eton and Oxford. He worked somewhat haphazardly in the family film production business. He had been raised inside an institutional family in a way that had produced a man who was kind, conventional, and had never been required to develop any particular sharpness, because sharpness was not what his life would demand. Penny was 21. By the descriptions of those who knew her then, she was thoughtful, intelligent, careful, and possessed of an interior life that she did not advertise. She was beautiful, but in a way that did not announce itself, with dark hair and a quality of stillness that made her noticeable in rooms after one had already noticed everyone else. She was also in the way that the children of ambitious self-made men are sometimes ambitious themselves, alert to the architecture of the world she was entering. She did not pursue Norton in any visible sense. She did not need to. The architecture pursued itself, with both of them as agreeable participants. They were engaged in 1978. The engagement was approved by both families, which mattered, and by Norton's grandfather, Lord Mountbatten, which mattered more. Mountbatten, who at 78 was still the patriarch of the family in a way that exceeded his official position in any institution, took an interest in his grandchildren's marriages that some of them found supportive and some of them found intrusive. He met Penny several times during the engagement. He approved of her, which was communicated through a series of small gestures and explicit remarks to family members, and which mattered because Mountbatten's disapproval would have been complicating in ways that the family would have struggled to manage. The wedding was scheduled for the autumn of 1979. It did not happen on schedule. On the morning of August 27, 1979, Lord Mountbatten was killed by an IRA bomb placed on his fishing boat off the coast of County Sligo in Ireland. 3 other people were killed with him, including his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas, who was Norton's younger brother. Norton's mother, Patricia, was severely injured. Norton's father, John, was severely injured. Doreen, Lady Brabourne, who was John Knatchbull's mother, was badly injured and died the following day. The Mountbatten family was, in the space of an afternoon, devastated in a way that was partly physical and partly something deeper than physical, and that would shape every subsequent decision the family made for the next decade. Penny was 26. She had been engaged to Norton for less than a year. She had met Lord Mountbatten perhaps half a dozen times. She had met Nicholas more often than that, because the Knatchbull children were close, and the engagement had brought her into family gatherings where Nicholas had been a cheerful and present teenager. The bomb did not target her, and she was not in Ireland that summer, but the bomb arrived in the household she was about to enter, with a totality that meant the household she was entering was not, going forward, the household she had agreed to enter. It was something else, organized around grief, around the medical recovery of Norton's parents, around the funeral that would follow at Romsey Abbey, and around the broader public event that Mountbatten's death had become, with state honors, royal mourning, and the particular British pageantry that grief at that level required. She went to Norton. She did not, in any account that has been preserved, hesitate. She accompanied him through the funeral. She helped manage his parents' recovery, which was prolonged and physically demanding. She absorbed, into the early weeks of what was supposed to be her engagement, an experience of family catastrophe that most people do not encounter at all, and that very few encounter before they are formally part of the family. They married on October 20, 1979, 8 weeks after the bombing, at Romsey Abbey, the same church where Lord Mountbatten had been buried. The wedding had been planned for the previous month, before the bombing, and had been postponed. The decision to hold it at Romsey rather than relocate was made by Norton's parents, who were both still in recovery, and who had decided with the kind of austere insistence that survivors of catastrophe sometimes summon, that the family would not be defeated by the bomb. The wedding would proceed. The church where they had buried Mountbatten would be the church where they would marry his grandson. The continuity would be enforced. Prince Philip attended. The Queen attended. The Prince of Wales attended. The wedding photographs, which were extensively reported, showed a young couple in formal dress against a backdrop of senior royals in a country church in Hampshire. The captions described it as a happy occasion that had been touched by tragedy. What the captions did not and could not describe was the particular psychological texture of a wedding held in the building where you have just buried your grandfather and your brother, with the assassins still at large, and with your parents seated in the front pew bearing visible evidence of the explosion that had nearly killed them. Penny stood at the altar with Norton. She wore a long-sleeved white gown with a high collar. She held a small bouquet. She said the words, "The photographs from that day show a woman who is composed and who is not happy in any visible way, because the day was not designed for happiness, but who is also clearly not asking for the day to be any different than it is. She is performing the function the family requires. She has begun at 26 the particular labor that will define the rest of her life inside this family, which is the labor of providing steadiness for people whose lives have been, are being, or will be disrupted by forces they cannot control." Prince Philip noticed. This is documented in the indirect way that things involving Prince Philip and emotion are documented through subsequent behavior rather than contemporaneous statement. In the months after the wedding, as the Brabourne and Mountbatten families went through the long process of recovering from the bombing, Philip wrote to Norton's parents, visited them, and made a particular point of including the new Lady Romsey, as Penny was then known, in the family circulation. He had liked her at the wedding. He liked her more in the months that followed. She was, in the specific terms that mattered to him, useful. She did not flinch. She did not ask for attention. She managed surfaces. She had absorbed a catastrophe that was not hers and was conducting herself as if it were hers to absorb, which was the kind of thing that Philip, who had absorbed several catastrophes that were not strictly his, recognized. He did not, in this period, single her out in any way that would have been remarked upon. He was 60 years old. She was 26. He was the husband of the Queen and one of the most photographed men in the world. She was the new wife of the eldest grandson of his recently murdered uncle. The relationship that he was beginning to form with her, in the slow way that he formed relationships with women he considered worth his attention, was at this stage entirely within the parameters of family connection. There was nothing to remark upon. No one remarked upon it. Norton and Penny moved into Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate in Hampshire, that Patricia and John had given them as a wedding present, in a gesture that was practical, because the elder generation could not run the estate alone any longer, and symbolic because the estate would continue under the next generation, and also in a way that nobody quite articulated, an act of investment in Penny specifically, because it was clear that she was the person in that marriage who would actually run the house. She did. Broadlands, like many large English country houses in the late 20th century, was an institution as much as a residence, with a staff, a working farm, a public visiting program, and a calendar of family and royal occasions. Penny moved into the house and began, in the methodical way that would characterize everything she did, to learn how it worked. She did not redecorate dramatically. She did not impose. She studied. She learned the names of the staff, the rhythms of the agricultural year, the specifics of the building's maintenance requirements, the protocols around the parts of the house that contained Mountbatten's papers, and the parts that were open to the public. By 1981, she was running it. Norton was glad of this. He had grown up in the house, but had grown up as a son in it, which is a different relationship to a country house than the relationship of the person who has to actually run it. He was relieved to have a wife who could run it. He returned to his film work in London, which he conducted with the same diffuse competence he had always conducted it with, and Penny ran Broadlands, and the marriage settled into a pattern that resembled, in its surface arrangements, a successful upper-class English marriage of that period: separate professional interests, a shared family base, weekend life in the country, the eventual production of children. The children came. Nicholas, named for Norton's murdered brother, was born in 1981. Alexandra was born in 1982. Leonora was born in 1986. Penny was, by the accounts of those who saw her with her children during this period, an attentive mother, present in a way that her own mother had been present, and that the wider family she had married into often had not been. She did not delegate the children entirely to staff. She read to them. She drove them to things. She knew their teachers' names. The children grew up at Broadlands as Penny had not grown up, in the kind of expansive country house childhood that English children's literature is largely about. And Penny, who was still in her early 30s, organized it. It was during this period, in the early to mid-1980s, that her relationship with Prince Philip began to take on the particular shape that it would maintain for the next 35 years. He visited Broadlands often. The visits were unremarkable, in the sense that visits between members of an extended royal family to a country house owned by the senior surviving member of one of its allied branches are unremarkable. He had reasons to be there. He had grown up partly under Mountbatten's influence, and Broadlands had been for him, in the period before his marriage, one of the few places where he had felt entirely at home. He continued to feel at home there. He came to shoot, to see Patricia, to participate in the family weekends that were, in the particular grammar of the Mountbatten family calendar, expected. But he also, over time, began to come specifically to see Penny. The distinction matters because it was visible to the people in the household before it was visible to anyone outside it. He arrived, he had tea with her, he talked to her in a specific way, which was different from the way he talked to other family members, and which was different from the way he talked to people generally. The household staff at Broadlands, who were the first to notice this, did not comment on it, because country house staff are not paid to comment on what they notice. But they noticed. What he was responding to in her was something specific, and to understand it, it is necessary to say something about Prince Philip in the early 1980s, which is when this began. He was 62 when his goddaughter-in-law's relationship with him crossed whatever line it crossed into something that would later be described in carefully chosen euphemisms by the few journalists who tried to describe it. He had been married to the Queen for 35 years. The marriage was, by every account that has been preserved, a real marriage, in the sense that there was affection, partnership, and a shared institutional project, but it was also a marriage that had been organized, from the beginning, around the Queen's role rather than his own. He had given up his career, his name, his religion, and the political and social position he had occupied as a Greek prince in exile in order to support her accession, and the support was real, and the bargain had been entered into by both of them in good faith. But the bargain had cost him things that the ceremony of monarchy did not return. He had also lost most of the people he had been closest to. His mother, Princess Alice, had been a remarkable woman whose life had included exile, religious vocation, the founding of a Greek Orthodox order of nuns, and significant time in psychiatric institutions, and she had died in 1969. His sisters had remained in Germany, married into German aristocratic families, and Philip's relationships with them had been complicated by the war and by the long awkwardness of a family that had been on the wrong side of an event the family was not allowed to discuss. Mountbatten, who had been the closest thing he had to a father, had been blown up. His circle of male friends, never large, had thinned by the early 1980s through death and through the institutional drift that had moved him away from the people he had been close to in his naval days. He had, by this period, the carapace that he had constructed and that the public had come to recognize, the gruffness, the gaffes, the deliberate use of impolitic remarks as a tool for managing a public role he had not chosen. The carapace had calcified to the point where, for many people who encountered him in official contexts, it was indistinguishable from the man. But it was not the man. It was the surface he had built to protect the man, and the man underneath, by the early 1980s, was lonely in a way that the surface was specifically designed not to communicate. This is the most boring possible answer, and it is the correct one, and it is the one that the institutional record, such as it is, supports. She was intelligent, she was well-read, in a way that he was well-read, which was the way of an autodidact, by attention rather than by formal training. She was interested in things that he was interested in: environmental conservation, design, the practical management of land, the long agricultural history of the kind of estate that Broadlands was. She did not flatter him. She did not defer to him in the way that almost everyone he encountered deferred to him. She talked to him. She disagreed with him when she disagreed with him. She did this without making a performance of disagreeing, which most of the few people who disagreed with him performed. She was also, and this matters, beautiful, and 26 years younger than him, and the wife of a man he had known since infancy and was fond of, and the mother of children he had taken on as godchildren in the family pattern, and a person whose presence in his life was, on every institutional axis, entirely permissible. There was no door that needed to be pushed open. There was no transgression at the level of social access. He could see her as much as he wanted to, and the structure of the family permitted it without comment. What developed between them over the course of the 1980s was a friendship that was, in the assessment of the people closest to it, extraordinary in its depth and unremarkable in its conduct. They wrote to each other. He wrote to her with a frequency and a candor that, when described later by the few people who saw the letters or to whom Penny mentioned them, was startling. He had not, his closest friends believed, written to anyone like that for many years, possibly ever. The letters covered the range of subjects that he found interesting, which was a wider range than the public knew, and they covered them at length, she replied. The replies were not preserved by him in the same volume because his archive was managed by his private secretary's office in a way that hers was not, but they were preserved by her, with care, and they have not been released, and they will not be released. And the question of what happens to them when she dies is a question that her family will have to answer at some point, and the answer is not yet known. It is also necessary to say, because the public discussion of this relationship has been clouded by the prurience that always clouds public discussion of relationships involving older men and younger women, that there is no reliable evidence the relationship was ever sexual. The phrase "no reliable evidence" is doing work in that sentence that should be acknowledged. It does not mean that the question has been resolved. It means that the people who would be in a position to know, the small circle of family and household staff who observed the relationship over 35 years, have not in any documented case suggested otherwise, and that the documentary record that exists in the form of letters and other correspondence has been, by every account that has been published, characterized by intellectual and emotional intimacy rather than physical intimacy. The British tabloid press in the 1990s and 2000s repeatedly attempted to construct a sexual scandal narrative around the friendship and repeatedly failed to produce evidence, and eventually largely abandoned the attempt, not because it would not have sold papers, but because the evidence was not there. What was there instead was something more difficult for the British press to describe, which was a friendship of unusual closeness, conducted across a generational and institutional divide that in most other times and in most other lives would have prevented it from forming at all. The institution that surrounded Prince Philip, which is to say the British royal household, and the wider apparatus of government, security, and protocol that managed his daily life, was aware of the friendship, monitored it in the indirect way that all of his relationships were monitored, and did not intervene. This is its own piece of evidence. The institution intervenes when it judges intervention to be necessary. It did not intervene in this case. The family, which is to say the Queen, was aware of the friendship and did not object. This too is its own piece of evidence. The Queen's own view of Penny, to the extent it can be reconstructed from the limited and carefully managed sources, was warm. She included Penny in family events. She invited her to Sandringham and to Balmoral, in the family gatherings where Philip's friendship with Penny would have been most visible, and where, if there had been any institutional unease about it, the unease would have been most easily expressed by simply not inviting her. She was invited. She continued to be invited, year after year, decade after decade. She was a presence in the family photographs, in the carriage processions at Royal Ascot, in the Christmas gatherings at Sandringham. The Queen knew her husband well enough to know what was happening, and well enough to know what was not happening, and she made the judgment which was hers to make, that the friendship was a friendship and that her husband was entitled to it. The carriage driving is where the friendship became visible. Prince Philip had taken up competitive carriage driving in 1971 after he had been forced to give up polo because of arthritis in his right wrist. The choice was characteristic. He had identified a sport that would allow him to continue the kind of physical engagement with horses that he had practiced his whole life, and that had the additional virtue of being sufficiently obscure that he could approach it without the institutional weight of public attention that adhered to more prominent sports. Carriage driving was in 1971 a small world. Philip's involvement in it was for the most part conducted away from cameras. He competed at the highest amateur level. He represented Britain at the World Driving Championships. He wrote a book about the rules and history of the sport, which is still cited in the carriage driving community as a definitive text. The driving was, in the texture of his life, one of the things that allowed him to remain himself inside the role he had been given, and he protected it accordingly. Penny took up carriage driving in the mid-1990s. The trigger for this was a personal event of a different kind, which is the death in 1991 of Penny and Norton's younger daughter, Leonora, from a cancer of the kidney at the age of 5. The death of a child is the kind of event after which any biographical account is required to slow down, because the temptation to glide over it is the temptation to mistake the surface of grief for its substance, and the substance is not glidable. Leonora was 5 years old. She was the youngest of Penny and Norton's 3 children. She had been diagnosed with Wilms tumor, a kidney cancer that primarily affects children, the previous year, and had been treated at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London, and had not responded to treatment in the way that the doctors had hoped, and had died at Broadlands on October 22, 1991, after several weeks during which Penny had effectively stopped functioning in any other capacity in order to be present with her. The funeral was at Romsey Abbey, the same church where she had married Norton, the same church where Mountbatten had been buried. The Knatchbull family had now buried in that church the patriarch, a teenage son, and a 5-year-old daughter, all in the space of 12 years. The accumulation of grief was, by the accounts of those close to the family, the thing that defined the household for several years afterward, and the thing that Penny, in particular, was working to manage without being broken by. Prince Philip wrote to her. He wrote to her at length. He had himself, by this point, watched several family members and several close friends die, and he had developed, in the long and largely private project of his interior life, a particular understanding of grief that was unsentimental, practical, and rooted in a religious sensibility that was real but that he did not advertise. He had been raised in the Greek Orthodox tradition, had converted to the Church of England at the time of his marriage, and had, across the decades, conducted a serious and largely undocumented engagement with Christian theology that included correspondence with the Archbishop of Canterbury on points of doctrine that the Archbishop had found surprising in their depth. The letters he wrote to Penny in the months after Leonora's death have been described, by the few people who know about them, as among the most substantial things he ever wrote. He sent her writing by C.S. Lewis. He sent her his own thoughts at length on the experience of losing people. He did not, in the descriptions that survive, attempt to console her in any conventional sense. He treated her as someone capable of receiving the real thing, which was an analysis of grief rather than a softening of it, and he sent her the real thing. What this constituted in the context of their relationship was an escalation. Up to this point, the friendship had been substantial but lateral. After Leonora's death, it became something deeper. He had given her, at the moment in her life when she most needed it, a particular kind of attention that her husband, who was also grieving, was not capable of giving, and that her family, which was occupied with its own structures, was not configured to give, and that the institutional apparatus of public sympathy that surrounds a death in a prominent family was specifically not designed to give. Norton was destroyed by the loss in a way that Penny had not anticipated, and that the marriage did not survive intact. He withdrew. He drank more. He was less present at Broadlands. He developed, over the following years, a series of relationships with other women that became progressively less discreet, and that were known within the family circle long before they were known publicly. The marriage, which had been functional and affectionate up to the point of Leonora's death, became, in the years afterward, the kind of marriage that two people maintain because dismantling it would require energy they no longer have available, and because the children require it, and because the institutional life of the estate requires it. Penny did not in any visible way retaliate against Norton's withdrawal. She did not match his behavior. She did not seek the kind of public dissolution that would have been available to her. What she did instead was redirect her attention, in the way that someone in a marriage that has stopped working redirects attention, into the parts of her life that were still working. She redirected it into the children. She redirected it into the management of Broadlands, which expanded in this period into a program of agricultural reform and environmental management that became, over the following 2 decades, one of the more ambitious estate-level conservation projects in southern England. She redirected it into charitable work, which became, again over the following 2 decades, a substantial portfolio centered on cancer research and the support of bereaved families, drawn directly from her experience of Leonora's death, and she redirected it into Philip. The friendship intensified. They saw each other more often. They corresponded more. He encouraged her to take up carriage driving, which she did, at first as a kind of therapeutic activity that gave her something to do that was hers, and then with the seriousness that she brought to anything she committed to, until by the late 1990s she was competing herself, at a level below his but in the same world, and they were appearing together at carriage driving events with sufficient frequency that the British tabloid press, which had not been paying attention before, began to pay attention. The first major piece of public attention came in 1999 when several British tabloids published photographs of Philip and Penny at a carriage driving event at Sandringham and accompanied the photographs with insinuating captions. The captions were the kind of captions that do not say what they are insinuating. They use the word close, they use the word companion, they mention the age difference, they mention that Norton was not present at the event. The captions did not produce a story in the sense that there was no story to produce, no source, no quote, no document, but they produced an atmosphere, and the atmosphere persisted. Penny's response and Philip's response was to do nothing. They did not issue denials. They did not modify their behavior. They did not stop appearing at carriage driving events together. They continued. The institutional position of the royal household, which was communicated through the channels by which the royal household communicates these things, which is to say through the absence of any communication, was that there was nothing to comment on. The friendship was a friendship. The Queen knew about it. The Queen was unconcerned. The press, faced with this kind of institutional silence and lacking the documentary evidence that would have allowed them to push past it, eventually moved on, because there were always other stories. But the atmosphere persisted, and it did so for the rest of Philip's life, and it shaped the way Penny was perceived in the public mind, in the limited public mind that had any awareness of her at all, for the next 2 decades. She became, in the small fraction of the British press that paid attention to her, a figure who existed in implication rather than in statement. The implication was managed by the palace, which neither confirmed nor denied. The implication was managed by Penny herself, who neither confirmed nor denied. The implication was managed in the end by the Queen, who simply continued to invite her to family gatherings, and whose inclusion of her was the most significant institutional statement that anyone on any side of the question was prepared to make. The carriage driving continued throughout the 2000s. They competed, they traveled to events, they sat together at the dinners that followed events. The photographs from this period, which exist in considerable volume because the carriage driving community is a community of enthusiasts who photograph their events extensively, show the two of them in conversation, in shared concentration on the technical questions that the sport produces, in the kind of relaxed engagement that two people who have known each other for 30 years and who genuinely enjoy each other's company display when they are not performing for anyone. The photographs are unremarkable to anyone who does not know who the people in them are. The photographs are, to anyone who does know, the most public available evidence of what the relationship actually was, which is two people who liked each other a great deal, and who had organized inside the constraints of their respective lives a way of seeing each other regularly and meaningfully across decades. The constraints were real. Philip was, throughout this period, the husband of the Queen and, after 1997, the senior royal participant in a family that was navigating the extended aftermath of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, with the institutional difficulty that that aftermath produced. He was committed to his marriage and to the institutional project that the marriage represented. He was not, by any account that has been published, in any sense disengaged from the Queen. The marriage in the late 1990s and into the 2000s was, by the descriptions of those who saw it closely, a partnership that had deepened in the period after Diana's death rather than weakened, because the death had imposed on the family a series of decisions that could only be made by Philip and the Queen together, and the making of those decisions had reinforced the structure of the marriage rather than eroded it. Penny existed alongside this, in a parallel that did not threaten it. Norton existed alongside this also, and existed in a more complicated position. He was Philip's godson. He was Penny's husband. He was aware, in the way that anyone in his position would have been aware, of the friendship, and he had his own friendships, and his own affairs, and his own life that had increasingly diverged from Penny's. The marriage continued as a structure. They lived at Broadlands. They appeared together at family events. They raised their 2 surviving children. They did not, by any account, conduct themselves as a couple in the daily texture of their domestic life. But they did not conduct themselves as enemies either. They had reached, by the early 2000s, the kind of arrangement that long marriages sometimes reach, in which the marriage continues for reasons that are no longer about the relationship between the spouses, and the spouses respect the reasons. What was happening between Philip and Penny in the 2000s and into the 2010s was something that the institutional structures around them had effectively normalized. The friendship was a friendship. It was 30 years old, then 40. It had its own routines. They wrote, they drove. They appeared at the events where their appearance was uncontroversial. They did not, in any documented case, push at the boundaries that the institutional context had established for them. There were no public outings together that were not within an acceptable family framework. There were no incidents. The British press, which had circled the relationship in the late 1990s and early 2000s, had found nothing that would convert into a story, and had largely moved on to other targets. By the 2010s, Penny had effectively disappeared from the news cycle altogether, except as an occasional named presence in the captions of group photographs at royal events. Inside this disappearance, the friendship continued, and it deepened in the particular way that long friendships deepen when both parties have grown old together. By 2017, when Philip retired from public duties at the age of 96, the friendship was 38 years old. He was now mostly at Sandringham, in the cottage on the estate where he had decided to spend his retirement, and where he could read, paint, and conduct the diminished social life of a very old man. Penny visited him there. The visits were frequent, were known to the family, and were unremarked upon outside it. He wrote to her, she wrote to him. The volume of correspondence in this period, by the accounts of those who later spoke about it carefully, was if anything greater than it had been in previous decades, because he had more time, and because the question of how much time he had remaining was now a real question, and the writing was a way of using the time. The death of the Duke of Edinburgh on April 9, 2021, was the event for which the institution had been preparing in the careful way that the institution prepares for many years. The plan, which had a code name and a set of protocols and a network of authorized recipients of various forms of notification, was implemented within hours. The Queen was at Windsor. The funeral was scheduled for 8 days later. The pandemic restrictions reduced the planned funeral, which under normal circumstances would have included approximately 800 mourners and a substantial international presence, to a service of 30 mourners conducted in St. George's Chapel under social distancing rules that the country was required to follow and that the royal family was performing in front of the country with conspicuous compliance. The 30-person guest list was the subject of significant internal discussion. The list was constrained by the regulations to immediate family and the closest of close associates. There was no room for the wider Mountbatten family in the volume that would normally have been included. There was no room for most of the friends that Philip had accumulated across his long life. The list was, in its final form, a document that revealed, by inclusion and exclusion, the institutional understanding of who Philip's most important relationships had been. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Penny was on the list. This was, by the standards of the institution, a significant statement, even if it was not formulated as one. The list had been narrowed to the people whose absence from the funeral would have been a substantive omission. Penny's absence would have been a substantive omission. Her inclusion on a list that had excluded most of the wider royal family's circle was the institution's quiet acknowledgement of what the friendship had been. She sat in the pew where she had been placed. She wore the veil. She did not weep visibly because she had been managing surfaces for nearly 50 years by that point, and the management of surfaces is a kind of muscle memory that does not relax for a funeral, even when the funeral is for the person to whom you have been writing and from whom you have been receiving letters. For almost half a century, she listened to the hymns, she watched the coffin lowered, she left the chapel after the service in the order that the seating plan dictated, which placed her in the cohort of close family friends, and she went back to Broadlands. What happened next is the part of the story that the institution will manage for as long as the institution continues to exist, and that will be managed after that by Penny's children and grandchildren, who will inherit a body of correspondence that they will at some point have to decide what to do with. Norton had died in 2017, 4 years before Philip. Penny had been a widow before she had been a widow in the more particular sense that Philip's death created. The Mountbatten title had passed to their son Nicholas, who became the 4th Earl Mountbatten of Burma, and Penny became the dowager. She continued to live at Broadlands, which by the terms of the family arrangement was now her son's house but was practically still hers, because she had been running it for almost 40 years, and Nicholas, who lived in London, had no interest in displacing her. She continued her charitable work. She attended royal family events when invited, which she continued to be by the Queen, until the Queen's own death in 2022. The Queen's death in September 2022 was for Penny a different kind of loss, because Elizabeth had been not only the wife of her closest friend but also, in the long parallel that the two of them had maintained, the person who had granted the friendship the institutional permission that had allowed it to continue. The Queen had known. The Queen had not objected. The Queen's continuing inclusion of Penny in the family circle had been the wordless statement that had answered, for almost 40 years, every question that the wider world had ever wanted to ask about what the friendship was. With the Queen's death, that wordless statement was now historical rather than continuing, and Penny's position in the royal family circle became, by definition, a position in a circle that was being managed by a different generation, with different priorities and different judgments. King Charles III, who had known Penny his whole adult life, continued the inclusion. He invited her to events. He confirmed through the kind of small institutional gestures that monarchs use to communicate continuity that she remained part of the family's accepted circle. But the texture of the inclusion was different. She was older. The relationships that had defined her place in the family were now mostly with people who were dead, and the people who were not dead were the next generation, who knew her as a long-standing presence rather than as a person whose presence required any particular interpretation. She turned 70 in April 2023. The birthday was unmarked publicly. She conducted a small private dinner at Broadlands. She continued her routines. The letters were in a room at Broadlands. The room had been chosen for the purpose. The letters were not catalogued in any formal sense, because the letters had not been written for a catalogue, but they were organized and they were complete in the sense that Penny had kept everything Philip had sent her across 40 years, and the volume was, by every account that has been able to verify any aspect of it, very large. What is in the letters is not, by any account that has been published, scandalous in the conventional sense. It is, by the descriptions that have been offered by people in a position to know without having read them in full, the record of a friendship between two intelligent people across half of the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. It includes Philip's reflections on his role, on the institution he served, on the country he had been brought to, on the family he had built, on the deaths he had absorbed, on the religious questions he had been working through across his adult life, on the books he was reading, on the conservation work he was doing, on the carriage driving, on the dogs, on the granddaughters, on the great-grandchildren, on the question of what he thought he had done with his life, and on the question of what he thought he had failed to do. It also includes the things he said to her about her, which are the things that are most particularly hers, and which are the things that the institution will be most concerned about, because they are the things that, if released, would convert a friendship that has been managed at the level of implication into a friendship that is documented at the level of statement, and the institution does not generally permit that conversion, because the institution operates on the principle that the unstated is more durable than the stated. The institution's interest in keeping the letters private is therefore not the institution's usual interest in concealing wrongdoing. The institution's interest is in preserving the indeterminacy that has characterized the friendship for 45 years. The indeterminacy has functioned, for both Philip and for the institution, as a form of protection. The friendship existed, was real, and was unchallenged. It was not asked to declare itself. It was not subjected to the institutional categorization that royal relationships are usually subjected to, because it was understood by everyone involved who mattered to operate at a register that did not require categorization. To release the letters would be to retroactively impose categorization, and the institution does not, on principle, retroactively impose categorization on relationships that have been allowed to exist outside it. There is also the more practical institutional concern, which is that the letters contain Philip's frank views on a wide range of subjects, including his frank views on members of his own family, on senior politicians, on public figures, on policy questions, and on the institution itself. These views, expressed in private correspondence to a person he trusted, are the kind of views that are not appropriate for public release while the people they concern are still alive, and many of them are still alive. The straightforward institutional answer to letters of that kind is that they remain private, and they remain private indefinitely, and the question of when they become public, if they ever do, is a question for a generation that does not yet exist. Penny has not, in any public statement, addressed the letters directly. She has not denied that they exist. She has not described them. She has, on the few occasions when she has been asked publicly about her friendship with Philip, given the same answer in different forms, which is that he was a great friend, that she was very fond of him, and that the friendship was sustaining for both of them. The answer is correct. It is also limited, in the way that her public statements have always been limited, to what she is willing to say in front of cameras, which has, across her entire adult life, never been very much. It is worth saying something about what the friendship cost her, because the public discussion of the friendship, when it has happened at all, has tended to focus on what it provided to Philip, and the question of what it cost Penny has been less examined. She had a husband whose marriage to her was diminished by the friendship's existence, regardless of what either of them thought about the diminishment. The friendship was not the cause of the marriage's deterioration, which had its own causes in the death of Leonora and in Norton's response to that death, but the friendship's existence created an asymmetry in the marriage that made the deterioration easier to extend. Norton knew that Penny had a relationship that was, in the dimensions that mattered most to her interior life, more substantial than her relationship with him. He could tolerate this knowledge in part because the relationship was, by structure, not a sexual relationship. He could not erase the knowledge, and he did not. The marriage continued in its particular form, which was a form that was not the form Penny had agreed to at 26. She also gave up the possibility of any other significant relationship. The friendship with Philip had occupied, from the time she was 30, the central place in her interior life that in another life would have been occupied by a romantic partnership. She did not seek another partnership after Norton became distant. She did not seek one after Norton died. The friendship with Philip was the relationship of her adult life. When it ended in 2021 with Philip's death, she was 68 years old, and the central organizing relationship of her adult life was now retrospective, and she was alone in a way that she had not been alone in 40 years. She also gave up, in a quieter and longer way, the public version of herself. She had become, by the early 1990s, a person who could not say what she thought in public, because what she thought was too proximate to the friendship, and the friendship was too proximate to questions she did not wish to answer. She had become a person who appeared in photographs and did not give interviews. She had become a person whose interior life was, by her own decision, a closed system. This is a substantial set of costs. The friendship paid them. Whether it paid them in proportion to what it gave her is not a question that admits of an external answer. It is a question that she would have to answer, and her one available answer, on the few occasions she has been asked, has been to characterize the friendship as sustaining. The word does work. Sustaining is not the same as fulfilling. It is the word for something that allowed her to continue, and the continuation, across the events that her life included, was not a small thing to have been allowed. It is in the alone evenings, presumably, that she wrote to Philip. The letters were almost certainly composed in the small sitting room on the first floor that had been her room for 40 years. She wrote at length. She wrote by hand. The letters went into envelopes that were addressed to Philip and that were delivered to him through channels that were not the public mail system, because the correspondence had been substantial enough for long enough that arrangements had been made for it to move through the family network rather than through the post. He read them in the cottage at Sandringham in the last years in the late afternoons when his eyesight was still adequate for the task. He answered them. The answers went back through the same channels. The two-way correspondence, conducted in the ordinary handwriting of two people who had been writing to each other for 40 years, accumulated. When he died, the letters that he had received from her were, according to the institutional protocols that govern his estate, removed from his cottage and placed in the archive of his papers, which is held at Windsor Castle in the Royal Archives, and which is administered by the Royal Archivist's Office on behalf of the monarch. Whether the letters from her to him will ever be released is a question that depends on decisions that will be made by future monarchs, and the practice of the Royal Archives is to not release private correspondence of senior royals during the lifetimes of the people involved, or their children, which means by the conventional protocol that the letters from her to him will not be released for some period that exceeds her own remaining lifetime. The conventional protocol also tends to extend, in cases involving particularly sensitive correspondence, beyond the lifetimes of the children and into the next generation. The practical answer to the question of when the letters from her to him will become public is therefore not in any time frame that is currently meaningful. The letters from him to her are in a different position because they are at Broadlands and they are her property, and the disposition of them is hers to decide. She has not in any public statement indicated what she intends to do with them. The conventional answers in cases of this kind are that the correspondent of a senior royal either burns the letters or returns them to the Royal Archives during her lifetime, or instructs her executors to return them upon her death, or instructs her executors to do something more idiosyncratic, which can include placing them with a university archive under embargo, or transferring them to a family member with specific instructions about future disposition, or destroying them. It is not currently known which of these she has chosen. The institutional expectation, communicated through the channels by which the institution communicates these expectations, is that the letters will be returned to the Royal Archives, either during her lifetime or upon her death, and will be sealed alongside the corresponding letters from her to him for a period that exceeds the foreseeable institutional horizon. This is the expectation. It is not a guarantee. The more interesting question is what Penny herself thinks about this. The few people who know her well enough to have asked her, and who have been willing to speak about it afterward, have indicated that her view of the letters is that they were a private correspondence between two people, and that the privacy of the correspondence was the condition under which it was possible, and that releasing the correspondence would be a violation of the agreement that had made it possible in the first place. This view is consistent with the way she has conducted herself across the entire period of the friendship, which is to say with an absolute commitment to the principle that the things that happen in private are not for public consumption. There is a separate question, which is whether the historical record is owed something that the principle of privacy is not prepared to provide. The argument for release, which has been made in various forms by historians and by journalists across the past several decades, is that Prince Philip was a significant historical figure, that the inner life of significant historical figures is a legitimate subject of historical inquiry, that the letters represent the most substantial body of his private writing, and that the letters' continued sequestration impoverishes the historical understanding of a person whom the historical record is otherwise required to assess from the limited evidence of his public statements and actions. The argument has merit. It also has an institutional answer, which is that the historical record is allowed to wait, and that the institutional protection of privacy at the level of senior royal correspondence is more important in the institution's judgment than the historical record's interest in immediate access. It is necessary before closing to say something about the alternative readings of this story, because the alternative readings have been the dominant readings in the parts of the public discussion that have addressed the story at all. The first reading is that the friendship was a disguised affair, that the discretion was the discretion of an affair, and that the institutional silence is the silence of an institution that knows the truth and is committed to not stating it. This reading is available. It cannot be definitively disproved. It is, however, inconsistent with the texture of the evidence that does exist, which is that the relationship between Philip and the Queen during the period of the friendship was by all accounts deepening rather than weakening, and that the Queen's continuing inclusion of Penny was active rather than tolerated, and that the people who were closest to the situation across decades have not, in the years since Philip's death, suggested that there was anything to discuss in the way that this reading would suggest. The second reading is that the friendship was an emotional affair regardless of whether it was a sexual one, that the time and attention Philip directed to Penny across 40 years were things he could have directed to his wife, and that the friendship was therefore a form of betrayal, regardless of the technical terms of its conduct. This reading also has merit. It also has limits. It assumes that the marriage between Philip and the Queen had a fixed quantity of available emotional and intellectual capacity, and that Penny's friendship was drawing from that capacity. The available evidence about the marriage suggests, instead, that the marriage had its own deep structure and its own deep capacity, and that the friendship with Penny existed in a parallel rather than in a competition. The Queen was not deprived of her husband's attention by Penny. The Queen had her husband's attention. The Queen also understood that her husband was a person whose interior life required engagements that the institutional life of the monarchy did not provide, and the Queen, who was herself a person whose institutional life required substantial sublimations, allowed it. The third reading is the most interesting, which is that the friendship was simply what it was, which is a friendship of unusual closeness across an institutional and generational divide, and that the cultural categories that are available for describing such friendships are inadequate to the friendship itself, and that the institutional and personal management of the friendship across 40 years was a sustained creative response to the inadequacy of the categories. This reading is the one that this account has tried to develop. Penny chose, at 26, to enter a family that demanded labor of a kind she could not have anticipated. She chose, at 38, after the death of her child, to accept the support of a man who was offering it for reasons that included his own loneliness, and she gave him her support in return. She chose, across the long decades, to maintain a friendship that was in its texture the most substantial thing in her life, and to maintain it in a way that did not require her to disclose it to anyone outside the small circle that already knew. She chose, when he died, to manage the public surface of her grief with the same discipline she had managed the public surface of the friendship. She is choosing now what to do with the letters. Her likely choice, by every indication available, is to do nothing dramatic with them. The letters will sit for the rest of her life in the room at Broadlands. Upon her death, by the conventional institutional protocol, they will be returned to the Royal Archives and will join the corresponding archive of her letters to him, and the combined archive will be sealed by the institution, and the institution's seal will hold for as long as the institution does. The letters will become, in the institutional language, papers. They will be catalogued. They will be referenced in the briefing documents that future archivists prepare for future monarchs who request occasional access. They will exist, but they will not be readable. This is the outcome that the institution prefers. It is also, by the available indications, the outcome that Penny prefers. It is the outcome that Philip himself, in the particular formulations of privacy that he held across his life, would have preferred. The outcome therefore has, on every relevant axis, the consent of the people whose consent is structurally relevant to it. It is worth lingering for a moment longer on the carriage driving, because the carriage driving is the place where the friendship was most visible, and the visibility of the carriage driving has been the principal piece of evidence that the public has been allowed to see. Carriage driving as a competitive sport is structured around three disciplines: dressage, the marathon, in which a driver navigates a cross-country course that includes a series of obstacles called hazards, which are constructed of timber and that test the driver's ability to find the fastest line through a complicated geometry while keeping the team and the carriage intact; and cones. The combined score determines the result. Philip's strongest discipline was the marathon. He was a tactician. He liked the problem of finding the line through a hazard. He drove four in hand, which is the most technically demanding configuration in the sport. Penny started with a single pony. She progressed over several years to a pair and then to a team. She drove ponies rather than horses. She was good at it. She was not at Philip's level, but she was a serious competitor, and she competed seriously. The events at which they appeared together, Sandringham, Windsor, the Royal Windsor Horse Show, were events at which the structure of the day allowed for considerable informal time alongside the competitive components. There were long hours between the morning's dressage and the afternoon's marathon. The structure of the events allowed Philip and Penny to spend extended periods of unstructured time together in a context that was institutionally sanctioned, that was attended by people who were committed to not photographing them or remarking on them, and that was, in the broader pattern of their lives, one of the principal ways in which they were able to be together at length. The British carriage driving community, which is a small, technically focused community of people who care intensely about the sport and who do not particularly care about anything else, became, over the decades, a kind of protected zone for the friendship. The community knew. The community did not talk. The community had its own internal politics and its own internal gossip, but the gossip was about the sport and not about the relationships of the people who attended the sport. Philip was a fellow competitor who happened to also be the Duke of Edinburgh. Penny was a fellow competitor who happened to also be Lady Romsey and later the Countess Mountbatten of Burma. The fact that they were close was a fact of the local landscape, like the fact that certain hazards were difficult and certain judges were strict. When Philip stopped competing in the late 1990s, because of the inevitable physical limitations of advancing age, he continued to attend events as a spectator and as an organizer, and he continued to attend with Penny, who continued to compete. The pattern of attendance shifted but did not break. By the 2010s, when Penny had also largely stopped competing, the pattern had shifted again into one in which they attended events as senior figures of the community rather than as participants, and in which they sat in the marquee at the side of the course and talked, and the carriage driving carried on around them as a kind of moving backdrop to the conversation that they were having and that they had been having, in different forms and different settings, for 30 years and then 35 and then 40. This was, by the descriptions of those who saw it, a pleasant way to spend a long afternoon. It was also, in the longer arc of their relationship, the principal way they spent the time they had together. The relationship had its dramatic events: Leonora's death, Norton's withdrawal, the press attention of the late 1990s, Philip's eventual retirement, his death. But most of the relationship was not its dramatic events. Most of the relationship was the long afternoons at carriage driving competitions, with the conversation that the long afternoons allowed. This is in a way the most accurate characterization of what the friendship was. It was a long afternoon's conversation, conducted across decades, with the dramatic events arriving at intervals that were unwelcome and that did not change the basic character of the conversation. The conversation was the thing. The conversation was the thing both of them needed, and that neither of them got from anyone else, in the same form, in the same volume, with the same trust. The carriage driving was the alibi for the conversation. The institutional structure of family connection was the wider alibi for the carriage driving. The Queen's tolerance was the wider alibi for the institutional structure. The whole arrangement nested into itself, layer upon layer, and the conversation continued at the center of it, which was where Penny and Philip were. The funeral, in this analysis, was the day the conversation ended. It had been ending for some weeks, in the small ways that conversations end when one of the participants is dying. He had stopped writing letters in the final weeks when he was no longer well enough to write them. The conversation had narrowed to brief telephone calls, and then to messages relayed through the small circle of intermediaries who attended him. By the time of his death, the conversation was a memory rather than an active thing. After the funeral, the conversation became fully retrospective. There would be no more letters. There would be no more long afternoons. There would be only the letters that already existed in the room at Broadlands and the memory of the long afternoons in the head of the surviving participant. Penny carried both home from Windsor. The carrying continues. There is one further element that should be mentioned, which is the granddaughters. Philip's relationship with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren was, across his last several decades, one of the central pleasures of his life, and Penny's children and grandchildren were folded into this circle in a way that was, in the particular grammar of his affections, distinctive. He took an interest in Nicholas, in Alexandra, in their children, that exceeded the interest he took in the children of other family members at the same level of relationship. When Princess Eugenie chose Penny as the godmother of her son August, born in 2021 only weeks before Philip's death, the choice was, in the discreet way of royal godparenting, a confirmation that Penny's place in the family circle had been formalized at the level of the next generation. She would continue to be present in family events because she would now have a formal role in them. The role was small, but in the institutional structure of the royal family, small roles are not nothing. They are the structures by which long-term inclusion is maintained, and Penny's inclusion was being maintained. This was by every indication what Philip had wanted. He had not been able to grant her any institutional position himself, because the institutional positions in his life were not his to grant. The Queen had granted what she had granted. The next generation, with Eugenie's choice and with similar choices made by other family members across the years, had granted the rest. By the time he died, Penny was as fully inside the family circle as she could be without holding a title within the family directly, and her place inside the circle was protected against any future shift in institutional priorities, because too many people in too many positions had committed to her presence. She carried this also to the funeral. The veil was pulled down, the seat was 3 pews back, but the protection was complete. The institution that had managed the relationship for 40 years was now managing the aftermath, and the management was, in its quiet way, generous. She had been included. She would continue to be included. Her grandchildren would grow up inside the circle that her own friendship with Philip had, by its long duration and its careful conduct, made hers as well as his. The letters Buckingham Palace will never release are, in the end, the letters that two people wrote to each other across 40 years inside an arrangement that the institution permitted, that the family supported, and that the public was not invited to read. The institution will not release them because the institution does not release private correspondence of senior royals. The family will not release them because the family does not release private correspondence of family members. Penny will not release them because she is the kind of person who does not release things that were given to her in confidence, and the letters were given to her in confidence, and she has held confidences for the entirety of her adult life. What is left for the historical record that exists outside the sealed archive is the shape of the friendship. The shape is what this account has tried to describe. The shape is a friendship that began at a wedding in a country church in Hampshire in October 1979. That deepened across the long, difficult decades of the 1980s and 1990s, that survived the deaths of children and parents and spouses, that was visible to those who watched carefully and invisible to those who did not, that produced a body of correspondence whose volume and quality has been described by those who know about it as exceptional, and that ended on the morning of April 9, 2021, with the death of one of the two participants. The other participant, who is alive at the time of this account, lives at Broadlands in Hampshire. She is 72 years old. She is the Dowager Countess Mountbatten of Burma, by virtue of a marriage she entered at 26, to a man who has been dead for 8 years, into a family that no longer contains the patriarch who originally invited her into it, alongside an institution that continues to include her at the level of close family friend in the events at which her presence is sought. She continues her charitable work. She continues to see her children and her grandchildren. She continues, when she has the time and the inclination, to drive a carriage, although less competitively than she used to. She thinks about her friend. The thinking, by all the structural evidence available, occupies a substantial portion of her interior life now, in the way that the thinking about a major friendship occupies the interior life of anyone who has been left after the friendship has ended. She does not in any public way share the thinking. She does not share it with the press. She does not share it with the public. She does not share it with the historians who have, on a small number of occasions over the past several years, sought to interview her about her friendship with the Duke. The historians have been politely declined. The interviews have not happened. She has, in this respect, won. The institutional management of her relationship with Prince Philip across 40 years was a project, and the project succeeded. The friendship was conducted. The friendship was protected. The friendship ended when it ended in a form that had not been forced into any of the categories that the categories would have failed to fit. The cost of the success was that the friendship is not, and will not be, available to the public in the form of its actual documents, and the public will have to accept the public's exclusion from the documents. This is on balance probably the right outcome, given what the friendship was. The friendship was an arrangement of considerable subtlety between two intelligent people who had each been shaped by lives of considerable difficulty and who had found in each other a particular kind of relief that neither of them had found elsewhere. The arrangement was not transgressive in the legal or moral sense. It was transgressive in the more interesting sense of being a relationship that the available categories did not accommodate and that therefore had to be protected from the categories by the parties to it. The protection has held. The protection will continue to hold. The seating plan at the funeral was in this regard a final visible expression of the protection. She was in the chapel. She was 3 pews back. She was visible enough to satisfy the requirement that she be present. She was distant enough to satisfy the requirement that she not be presented as anything other than what the institution had agreed to present her as. The institution managed it. She accepted the management. The funeral concluded. She left. The country watched the funeral on television. The country saw the Queen alone in her pew. The country did not particularly notice the woman in the veil 3 pews back, because the country had not been told in any official capacity what to notice about her, and the country on the whole takes its instructions from the official capacities about what to notice. This was a deliberate outcome. It is the outcome that the institution had been working toward for 40 years. It is the outcome that by every available indication, both Philip and Penny had been working toward as well. The friendship is now historical. The friendship will be discussed in private by the small number of people who knew about it and who are still alive, for as long as they are alive. The friendship will be referenced, in the limited way that the available record permits, by future biographers of Prince Philip, who will note its existence and will be unable to say more about it than the available record permits. The friendship will pass eventually into the oblivion that contains most relationships that have not been formally documented for public access, which is the oblivion that contains most of the actual texture of human life across most of human history. This is perhaps the appropriate ending for it. Most of the things that happen between two people happen between those two people, and they pass with them. The expectation that the things that happen between two famous people are owed to the public is a recent expectation, produced by the recent technologies of mass attention, and the expectation has not always existed and will not always exist. The friendship between Penny Knatchbull and Prince Philip belongs by the standards that prevailed during their lifetimes and that they themselves endorsed, to them and not to the public. The fact that the public is curious is not, on any view that they would have endorsed, a sufficient basis for converting their relationship into a public document. In Hampshire, at Broadlands, in a room on the first floor that has been her room for almost half a century, Penelope Knatchbull, who was once Penelope Eastwood, and who has been the Dowager Countess Mountbatten of Burma since her husband's death in 2017, sits in the long evenings with the letters that document a friendship the public was not invited to read. She is alone, in the way that she has been alone since the friend who occupied the central place in her interior life died 4 years ago. She is also not alone, in the way that someone who has the major correspondence of their adult life in the room with them is not alone, even when the correspondent is dead. The letters are present. The letters are read. The letters are folded back into their envelopes and returned to the room where they have been kept. The room is locked in the evenings when she has finished. The keys are kept in a place that is known to her and to her son, who is now Earl Mountbatten, and who will, when she dies, have to make the decisions about the letters that the institution has been quietly waiting for someone to make. He will make them in consultation with the institution, and the decisions will be the decisions that the institution prefers, because the institution has been managing decisions of this kind for centuries, and has in the long run very rarely lost the management. The letters will go where the letters have always been going to go. They will be sealed. They will join the archive. The archive will hold. What was it in the end that they wrote about across 40 years in letters whose volume was substantial and whose contents will not be known? They wrote about everything. They wrote about the books they were reading, and the dogs they were keeping, and the gardens they were tending, and the deaths they were absorbing, and the children they were watching grow up. They wrote about the work he was doing, and the work she was doing, and the long institutional questions that the country was working through, and the smaller institutional questions that the family was working through. They wrote about the things that mattered to them, in the volumes that mattering to them required, with the candor that the privacy of letters permits, and that the privacy of public life does not. They wrote, across the long decades, the kind of correspondence that two people write when they have the time and the inclination and the trust and the sustained attention that long correspondences require. What it produced is in the room at Broadlands. What it produced will be sealed and will remain sealed for as long as the institutions in question continue to be the institutions they are. What it produced will not be available to the public. The friendship was theirs. It will remain theirs. It is the conclusion they would have wanted, and it is the conclusion they engineered, across the whole of the friendship's duration, by the discipline of their conduct, and by the care of their management of the public surfaces that they were both, in their different ways, expected to manage. They managed the surfaces held. The friendship is, by their own judgment, complete. Penny is 72. She will not, in any way that can be currently anticipated, change her position on the letters. The letters will remain hers in the practical sense for as long as she is alive, and they will pass on her death into the hands of her son, who will return them to the institution, and the institution will seal them, and the seal will hold. The country has moved on. The institution has moved on. The next generation of the royal family is establishing its own pattern of public life, and the long friendship between the late Duke and his goddaughter-in-law is settling, as such things settle, into the texture of the institution's accumulated history, where it will remain, alongside many other relationships of varying degrees of public visibility, as one of the threads from which the larger fabric is composed. This is, in its way, an achievement. It is the achievement that she wanted, and that he wanted, and that in its quiet completion has been delivered. The friendship is by their own measure finished. The letters remain. The letters will remain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.